everybody. So this lecture is going to be two parts. So this is going to be a two-video lecture on global migration. First, we're going to talk about some kind of concepts that I think it's really important to understand, especially when we're looking at global migration in the context of intercultural communication. And then after that, we're going to do kind of a case study looking at the history of the US-Mexico border to kind of apply the concepts and things that you're going to learn in this lecture. So before we get started, I want to review a couple terms that we've gone over in past lectures, and I just want to go over them very quickly here again. The first is this idea of neoliberalism. And as we've said before, neoliberalism is this idea that a free and unregulated market is the key to economic growth. This political and economic ideology that kind of came out of the 1970s, 1980s, and really took fire when Reagan was elected president here in the United States and when Margaret Thatcher was elected prime minister in the United Kingdom. And when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about these kind of series of changes in policy and in ideology that really kind of changed our global economy in pretty drastic ways, such as government deregulation, privatization of public resources, cuts to social spending, individualism and personal responsibility. Due to lack of time, I don't want to go over these too much, but if you need a refresher on any of these, please refer back to the video on neoliberalism. And then finally, I want to go over globalization one more time. We've defined it already, but I want to go over these kind of key components of globalization. One is this idea of accelerated flow of capital, global cities, flow of people, the altered social geography, and this idea of an increased and uneven interconnectedness. For this lecture, we're really going to be kind of focusing on the last three, in particular, flow of people and this idea of increased and uneven interconnectedness. And the reason why is because even though global migration has put us into closer proximity of people who are from different social locations as us, it happens in a very uneven and unequal way. And those larger processes are really important to understand if we want to understand the more meso and micro level interactions that we have with people across social location. In other words, examining positioning and framing an intercultural praxis. And so with that in mind, it's important to understand that global migration occurs within the context of neoliberal globalization. So one thing that I want to go over real quick is what I mean when I say global migration. I'm really talking about a mass exodus of people from the same geographic region. So I'm not talking about, maybe a few people here and there leave, maybe for an education or something like that. I'm talking about when mass groups of people leave their home region, and that could mean they move to another region of their country, or they move to an entirely different country altogether. So really what we're talking about here is the formation of a diaspora. And what that means is a diaspora forms is when one population becomes more spread out over a wider geographic area. So a group of people who are kind of more condensed in a smaller space and then moving in mass numbers to either another country or another region of their own country. And those are the two primary forms it can take. So when we're talking about moving from one region of the country to another region of the same country, we're talking about intra-national migration. And when we're talking about moving from one country to a different country, we're talking about international migration. So an example of the first one would be people who move from southern Mexico to northern Mexico in search of employment, right? That would be an example of intra-national migration. And international migration would be mass numbers of people moving from Mexico into the United States. They're actually leaving their home country altogether and moving to another one. But both of those are cases of that one population becoming more spread out over a wider geographic area. And so what I mean by the global in global migration isn't just this idea of leaving one's country in mass numbers. It's leaving in mass numbers in the context of neoliberal globalization, that these larger economic processes that you've kind of learned about over the past couple weeks facilitate the flow of people. And these are kind of some of the common factors that kind of facilitate that. Things such as economic decline, war, famine, basically anything that makes it impossible to continue living in one's home country. And another thing that I kind of want to go over when we're talking about global migration, especially within the context of intercultural communication, is that what your reading spends a lot of time kind of focusing on is the experiences of people who leave their home countries, what their experiences are like with people who are born within the country that they move to, what their relationships are like with family that they've now been separated from. And a lot of reason why these kind of cleavages between different groups happen is because when we're talking about immigration and how we understand immigration, it's because we have this idea of a nation, of belonging to a nation or a country. Right. And we kind of take that for granted. You know, we see, for example, might see ourselves as being from the United States, right? And we know that we identify with that country in some way because we were born here, or maybe we spent a good portion of our lives here, right? But it kind of becomes part of our identity, this idea of belonging to a particular nation state. And immigrant communities are often kind of constructed in a way as not belonging to that because they were not born within that nation. And so when we're talking about this idea of a nation state, we're kind of talking about kind of four different components. A nation state has a centralized sovereign government, a stable permanent population, laws or a constitution, and borders. You have all of those things. You have this thing called a nation state, and that's in the most formal sense. And we often take those four things and we take them to mean something more. We kind of develop a sort of identity around being within these borders, being raised under these laws, and with this population under this government. We kind of form an identity around that. And that has real profound impacts on how we interact with people who we consider outside of that. So really, when we're talking about the development of a nation state sets the parameters for who belongs and under what conditions somebody belongs. And we're going to come back to that in the second lecture and what exactly I mean by that. Another thing that I think is really important to understand when we're talking about immigration and global migration is it's important to understand that borders, one of these elements of a nation state, are constructed. And what that means is that they're man-made. They don't naturally occur. And it also means that they serve a social, political, and economic purpose. We don't draw borders just because. They serve a very specific purpose. It defines the lines of a nation state, so what land is owned by that nation. And it defines the role of everyone within those borders. And by that extension, it defines citizenship. It defines who can say that they're a member of that permanent, stable population, that other element of a nation state. And it also constructs citizenship in a way that's hierarchical, and that's also constructed. Citizenship is very much man-made as well, and we're going to explore that over the next couple weeks. But I think it is also important to give a little bit of a primer on citizenship itself. We have kind of legal, kind of very formal definitions of citizenship, and then we also have, and there's also an idea of citizenship that's a lot more abstract in ways that is often kind of taken for granted, and we're going to kind of spend the next couple weeks exploring that as well. And so in the formal sense, when we're talking about citizenship, there's kind of different levels of citizenship that somebody can have. And there's a few examples here, but this isn't an exhaustive list. This isn't all the ways in which a person can have some level of documentation. It's just some. So for example, a naturalized citizen, right? These are people who have gone through paid all the money and gone through all the process and taken all the tests and have been granted U.S. citizenship. Like, this is the highest level of formal documentation that a person who moves from another country can have. We also have things like legal and conditional permanent residents, who are people who are not citizens but do have a formal documentation that allows them to live in the country for very long periods of time. People who are here as refugees or political asylees, people on temporary visas, so like students are often on temporary visas, or people who are here because they were a victim of a crime or witnessed a crime and need to remain in the country for trial, for example, might get kind of a special visa. So we have all kinds of different ways in which we allow someone to remain in the country. Right? But even when we're talking about citizenship and the highest level of citizenship that a person can have, such as naturalized citizenship, even though we have a lot of people who have that, whether it's naturalized or because they were born here in the US, not everyone necessarily gets the full rights of a citizen. And when that happens, those people are called second-class citizens. Right? And so what that means is that these are people who are citizens but not granted the full rights of a citizen of a nation state. A really common example are formerly incarcerated people who, upon release, are not allowed to vote. Workplaces can legally discriminate against them because they have a criminal record, right? Because of that record, discrimination is legal against them, and they have a lot of rights revoked from them even after they've kind of served their debt to society and have served their time in prison. Right? When that happens, when things like that happens, it's called second-class citizenship. And I mention that here because I just want you all to kind of think about the ways in which citizenship is defined and who it's applied to and how it's applied. And then finally, we have undocumented, unauthorized, or displaced people. And these are people who are living in the country without any sort of documentation that says that they are authorized to be in the country. And really what citizenship is defining, like borders, is who belongs in a nation state. And under what conditions does somebody belong? Do they belong here as a student? Do they belong here as a refugee? Do they belong here because they witnessed a crime and we need them for something? Or have we decided that this is a person who's worthy of just kind of being here unconditionally? They've granted full naturalized citizenship. And there's a lot of different sets of politics that come into that we're going to explore in the next lecture. And so before we end, I just want to say something about the word illegal. We often hear undocumented people referred to as illegal. That's something that I won't be doing in this course, and I encourage everyone to do the same. And the reasons are here. One is that no human being is illegal. That's actually impossible. And to refer to someone as illegal is actually a slur. It says a person is criminal, that they are criminal, that their entire existence is criminal, rather than any specific action that they took. It's actually not a crime to live in the United States without documentation. It's a civil offense. That might sound like semantics, but it's actually a very important distinction, especially when we're talking about legalese. It actually is very different things with very different consequences. It's also not a crime to seek employment as an undocumented person. And more importantly, though, it ignores the larger global processes that facilitate migration in the first place. And we're going to get into that very specifically in the next lecture. So really, undocumented people are not criminals. They're displaced workers. They are people who move to the country out of reasons that and larger global factors that are beyond their control. And to just say that they're illegal, that they're just breaking the law just because, really doesn't take that into account. It's dishonest and it's derogatory, and I won't be using it in this course. So with that, the second video is going to look really deep at the US-Mexico border specifically to kind of try to apply some of these concepts that you've just learned about.